Angie Schmitt, our guest this evening, was, as many of you know her, as the longtime editor of StreetsblogUSA, where she covered national and international transportation policy. And she also wrote several stories about the movement for safer streets here in Massachusetts and Greater New England before Streetsblog Massachusetts existed. Beyond Streetsblog, her writing has also appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Bicycling Magazine, Good Magazine, Landscape Architect Magazine, and many other publications. She holds a master's degree in urban planning from the Levin College of Urban Affairs at Cleveland State University and an undergraduate degree in journalism. Thank you so much for joining us, Angie.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And thanks for writing this book.
Yeah.
So lots of information in here. I feel like feels very familiar to me as a longtime Streetsblog reader. So just to get started, I'm curious to hear how this book idea came together. Was it something you were thinking about while you were still writing for StreetsblogUSA?
Yeah, I was actually still working there when I started it.
Mhm.
And when I started writing it when, I have two really young kids. Like, well, my daughter was sort of a baby still, and I only had like 2 free hours a day. That was like 9 to 11.
Yeah.
That's when I started writing it. And I think I was just like spending a lot of time on social media, and I was just like, I should take some of the stuff I know. I wrote about this stuff for 9 years, which is a really long time to be on a beat as a reporter. And so I just accumulated a lot of knowledge, and I was like, I should take some of this and put it in a book. And part of the inspiration was I wrote about this stuff for so long before I started. Before I met these moms from Families for Safe Streets.
Mhm.
And I think like after having kids of my own, I just really felt really empathetic with the moms who had lost their children. And I think it was like, one of my biggest fears, like all parents, something happening to your kid. And in the United States, car crashes are the number one reason parents bury their children. So I did a little writing about them, and started thinking about, I think part of the struggle on this issue is that people don't really get their stories told very
Mhm.
much compared to some other issues like maybe the opioid epidemic.
Yeah. When you started researching for this book and putting it together, did it come together more or less the way you expected, or were there any surprising findings that sort of changed the direction of your sort of central thesis or the structure of the book or anything like that?
One thing that's weird about a book compared to just day-to-day reporting is just how long it takes
Yeah,
to
right.
go to print. So there were certain things that like I was ahead of everyone else on, that by the time the book came out
Yeah.
wasn't as like, for example, like I wrote one of the first chapters I wrote was the chapter about killer cars, and I had this like information from this kidsandcars.org about the big blind zones, and that nobody, and I'm not, it's not like I was trying to hold back information, but it was something I came across in my research and thought was really compelling. But a war on cars got a hold of that, a few months later, so that it was, not as fresh. And then of course this whole pandemic came, and
Yeah.
none of that was part of the thinking or reporting on it at all.
Yeah.
So that was kind of
Yeah.
surprising. I can't recall like shifting the direction of the book too much based on the research, I guess.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned in your author's note this book was published like right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think it was published before George Floyd's killing, right?
So, well, I finished writing it in February,
Uh,
like right before, yes, right before the pandemic
yeah.
happened is when I sort of like, quit writing, turned it in.
Yeah.
Yeah, so way before, before the pandemic even started, before I had any realization that it was going to be a big thing. And
Yeah,
yeah, but well before the George Floyd protests
right.
as well. I didn't even know. So we added this little note to the front of the book because
Yeah,
I just thought people are going to be confused maybe reading this.
yeah,
So we added that, but that was before. So even the thing we added, like sort of last minute, was before the George Floyd protests
right.
as well.
Yeah. No, it's been an insane year and an insane week, and it's probably going to keep on being insane. But I'm curious if there's anything in the book, like if you could revise and do a second edition now after all the everything that's happened in the past years. Would there is there anything you would want to add or focus more on?
Yeah, well, if I was going to add an additional chapter, originally I thought I would write a little bit about retail because I think like the model of retail we use, like big box stores,
Yeah.
ends up being a big contributing factor. We end up with these really dangerous roads around that. So I think the
Right.
evolution of retail. But I mean, since all this has happened, one thing I think like I've been paying a lot of attention to what some of the like leading Black planners and planners of color have been saying in some of their critiques of the planning
Mhm.
industry, and a lot of people like Tamika Butler or others will point out like we've been looking at safety a little bit too narrowly, and the book is mainly about traffic safety, but we do talk a little bit about police profiling.
Mhm.
But so yeah, I think like we're all the time we're progressing in the industry, so I think like the way we think about these issues is going to continue to evolve, and I think that's sort of the evolution that we're going to see around these kind of things.
Yeah, for sure. I think you have a couple of a few visuals that you wanted to share as well as that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah.
Bear with me
So
a moment.
so I'm just trying to think from my presentation. I know that a lot of you guys have read the book, so I don't want to repeat myself too much. Let's see here. I'll have to get into play slideshow. Um, Sorry, this is always so awkward. And I did that too soon. Sorry. Okay. Um, okay, now I'll do play slideshow. Yeah, so as some of you guys who have read the book, I think some of these visual things I walk people through are kind of interesting when I give these presentations. And this is usually how I start off. It's talking about, when the sort of theme of the book is this pedestrian safety crisis in the US, is what I call it. And this is sort of the pattern we see, about a 50% increase over a decade. And I even it's sad even during this pandemic with traffic being down so much. We haven't really seen much of an improvement there. It's sort of a huge failure. So when I talk about this, and this is something I talked about in the book, I think like one of our problems in addressing this is sort of we have this stereotype about who's being killed, and it's sort of like this guy here on the left. He's like a very wired millennial, and he's in a major city. And I think like anecdotally, this is what, a lot of like media columnists sort of see maybe when they're driving to work on their commute. And so this tends to be the focus. And I think that the reason that's happening a little bit is because the people who are in positions to comment about this are just sort of privileged. And myself included, by the way. And the reality is the type of people who are being killed are more like this guy on the right, who are just sort of sprinting across these dangerous arterials. And I think like not enough people in government, um, in media, in other positions of authority are really put in that situation. And that's one of the reasons they're not very sympathetic. So, when I talk about like who's being killed, obviously this is a theme in the book that we have these racial disparities. And I think, we've seen the same kind of pattern with Corona, where you would think this virus would sort of hit everyone equally. but this very severe inequality we have, um, systemic racism, really show up in this problem, and Black folks, Hispanic folks, and Native folks bear disproportionate burden for it. This was touched on briefly, also older people, but I think that this has been sort of underappreciated in the planning profession, just how quickly the population's aging and how like sort of poorly prepared we are to handle this big demographic change, just from like an urban design perspective. So I'm going to skip some of this, sorry. But yeah, you guys might be interested in this as well. This is something I use in my presentations. I use Cleveland, where I live, as sort of an example, but this is sort of a national phenomenon. And I talk about this a little bit in the book. These are just images I use to illustrate sort of how suburbs have changed. They're becoming more diverse and also lower income. So I use Cleveland here as an example, but this is again a national phenomenon. So in 1990, this is a racial segregation map, and the green here shows concentrated segregated areas where Black people live, and then orange shows where white people live, homogeneous white areas, and then the yellow shows the areas that are a little more diverse. So if we just look ahead 20 years, you can see like Cleveland is still very segregated, but there's been this outward migration. So now we have more folks, and for a variety of reasons, including like the wealth gap and discrimination, people of color are less likely to own vehicles. And, throughout the United States, those folks, low income people, there's some overlap there, but, a lot of this demographic change is Black people moving to the suburbs, which is also a big trend. But anyway, point being, there's a lot more folks who rely on walking and transit find themselves sort of out in suburban areas. And that's especially true in areas like Boston, probably, where there's a good deal of gentrification and in-town housing prices are so high. So I think that's contributing. And just to sort of compare, this is a map of the most dangerous corridors, road corridor segments in Cleveland. And just to point out how closely they match up with sort of, these segregated areas going all the way back to redlining in Cleveland. Again, that's pretty typical of what we would see in any city in the United States. And we don't even have the most recent data. So I would expect that when we have the new census data, this trend will be even more pronounced. What do you think, Christian? Should I keep up with this, or is this?
I really like this map. This is Portland, Oregon, which you mentioned this pattern in the book, but it's like East 82nd Avenue. Is that this? Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing I talk about in the book, so maybe some people who haven't read it, or you can see they produce this nice map in Portland, the Bureau of Transportation, and they use the names of the victims. This is 2 years of traffic deaths. They use the names of the victims to sort of humanize the issue, which I think is, everyone likes this map. But one thing about it is you can see that like they're not happening in a random pattern. There's a clear concentration over here. So this, for people who aren't familiar with Portland, there's this dividing line right here, East 82nd Street, and everything east of that is East Portland. So during these 2 years, about 50% of traffic fatalities in Portland were in East Portland, even though only about a quarter of the population lives there. And this is basically like the other side of the tracks in Portland. It's a more diverse, lower income area than the rest of the city. So I'm picking on Portland here, but this is a common thing we see in city after city. And I think you guys just did an analysis based on this in Boston and discovered.
I did, yeah. So after reading your chapter about how race plays into this, I was curious how it looks for Massachusetts, because as you're right, the problem's a lot more acute in Sunbelt cities, places like Arizona and Florida. And so I think there's a risk of people like us from Massachusetts saying like, oh, that's, that's not a problem here. We've got great transit. We've got walkable neighborhoods. But a lot of parts of Massachusetts are not very walkable, and a lot of parts of Massachusetts, and there are parts of Massachusetts where less privileged people live, are still very dangerous. And there are the parts of Massachusetts where, mid 20th century highway builders plowed their dangerous roadways. That said, I mean, so we did that analysis and saw plotted where the fatalities happen, and they're in places like Brockton and Springfield, where a lot of Black families live. But one of the things that's been frustrating for me writing for StreetsblogMASS Massachusetts is that it's very difficult to get victims' names for some reason in Massachusetts. I don't know if it's a law or if it's a cultural thing that the most news reports don't name the victim uh, uh, really at all, unless a victim's family comes forward and wants to talk about it. And as you write in the book, like a lot of victims' families don't want to talk about it because it's so stigmatized and there's so much victim blaming around it. But it is really important when you see people's names on a map. They're not just dots on a map. These are real people with families and lives and social networks. And so when you see these names, that for me this map is much more powerful. Even if you don't know about the sort of other geographic issues going on in Portland, Oregon. So yeah, like so I'm curious, talking about the victims' names, and you referenced that a little bit in your conclusion about trying to destigmatize traffic deaths and trying to talk about the victims more. What's that look like? What's that look like in Cleveland, for instance, where you are?
I was just thinking about that. It's rare that a pedestrian crash would rise to the level of being more than like a minor news story here, but it
Okay.
has happened. Like I can't think of one example from the last few years that I think I mentioned in the book, where a mother of 7 was killed, and I think everyone and it seemed that they seem to be able to tie it to something the Ohio Department of Transportation had done in a very low income area, largely Black area. So, but I was thinking, for one of these presentations, I should try to just put together a slideshow and just show the faces of some
Yeah.
of the folks who've been killed in Cleveland. And I was starting to think, I wonder what it would take to sort of pull that together. I think a lot of times, like the people that are killed this way are really really marginalized on a lot of levels. Like, I did a presentation or I just did something sort of like this with some folks in Nashville. And they were saying about like, I think they said about 30% of their pedestrian deaths were homeless people in
Mhm.
Nashville. So, and I think that there's like, because of the status of the victims, it can have a big effect on the kind of news coverage there is. Like if
Yeah.
Christian, you got killed walking tomorrow, I think like there would be um a lot of buzz about it, right? Like you're sort of a well-known person,
That's on you guys.
your job, yeah, your job like is relevant, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But for if it's someone who's a recent immigrant that still doesn't speak English and their family might not even be able to interface with the media quite as easily, there's just a lot of obstacles that people face.
Yeah. In the chat just now, Brendan from Walk Boston shared a very useful resource that they maintain is a spreadsheet of all the pedestrian fatalities in Massachusetts. So if people want to click the link, and you can see how many of the victims are unknown or unidentified. It's a lot. Um, so, obviously that's frustrating for me as a reporter, but also as someone who cares about sort of humanizing this issue for people, that makes it very difficult, because these are literally nameless victims right now. And that makes it much harder for people in power to care about them, unfortunately.
I wonder how that's even possible. Is the list just not complete? Or like, are there people who have missing persons that are missing a family member that they just, I don't understand.
It's kind of a mix. The way we track that is we are pulling it from news reports.
Mhm.
Um, because, and initially, like Christian was saying, like there's not necessarily a lot of information
Oh,
right
okay.
away.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we usually do go back and update it, but sometimes there is still not information. But I think what you were saying just before about people suffering from homelessness, and there are people on the margins that are kind of, there are not follow-up articles about the people that are impacted by those crashes because they're at the margins. Yeah, so if people want to, volunteer with Walk Boston and follow up on a bunch of these crashes over the previous years, happy to do it, and maybe we can do something with Christian too.
For
It
sure.
would be interesting. I just saw about a story about a guy that was killed biking in Jacksonville, Florida, and they didn't discover his body until like 2 days later, that kind of thing.
God,
So
that's terrible. Oh. Um,
sad. This is very sad stuff.
yeah, for sure. Yeah. So what was it like writing about this stuff? What with newborn children? like it is pretty rough to sort of immerse yourself in these like kind of depressing issues, right?
Yeah. Um, yeah, we should be used to it by now, right? With everything that's going on.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah. I don't know. It is. I think it's sort of strange the way I think like traffic safety issues. And I think like I'm still like this one kind of weirdo that is out there trying to beat the drum for this. I think a lot of people, they come into this and they're like, I want to be able to bike, and that's how I came into it, or I want my neighborhood to be better. Um, and I think all that stuff is really important. Like there's so many important issues, but I just feel like traffic safety in general, so many people are, we have as many as 40,000 deaths a year, which unfortunately Corona has come along and made seem small,
Yeah.
but just a lot of suffering. It causes so much suffering. And compared to, one of the things I point out in my book is, compared to our peer nations, we lose a lot more people. Like we have about twice as many traffic deaths as Canada.
Mhm.
So if we could do a little bit better on this, we could really improve. Um, we could really reduce suffering a lot, I think.
Yeah.
So I feel like I sort of want to tread carefully about this right now, because we've got really serious issues we need to be addressing, like with the pandemic and with that are obviously more important. This is like, traffic safety isn't always the most important thing, but I think it's more important than the attention it gets. Like
Mhm.
there's a gap there where the amount of harm it causes and the amount of attention it gets are not sort of proportional. And if we could get a little more attention to the problem, it would help a lot.
Yeah.
But it's a real struggle. It's a real
Yeah.
struggle. Do you want me to see what else? Um, Go through some more of these slides. Should we do that, or do you want to just keep talking?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. If you guys just want to ask me questions, that's okay too. But like, yeah, this is just a supplemental thing. I think it was in the book too. Stephanie Pollock, your state DOT director, did invite me to speak recently at an event that MassDOT did. So I know she's thinking about this, and that you guys are really lucky to be in a state that this is even really on their radar. This is another map they produced in Portland, and it's the 30 most dangerous intersections. And 28 out of 30 are in East Portland. So you can see there's this like total concentration, and
Mhm.
there's just this inequality in the infrastructure that goes back to privilege.
Mhm.
And this is, sort of an example I talked about in the book, but, can help explain why Native folks are set at such increased risk. And I think it's just an example how, we have sort of like this normative mind frame that we come to planning with, and we're sort of always planning for like the typical person, and that's like maybe a white male middle-aged business guy that rides his car on a highway to work every day. And then people who have different kind of experiences, which there's so many people don't fit that sort of stereotype. If they have a disability, or if they're not working, if they're retirement age, or if they're a child, or someone like this who lives on tribal land or reservation and has a different culture, different government, just aren't being well served. So we need to be more sensitive to those kind of things in planning, I think.
So related to that, we have a question in the Q&A right now asking whether you consider food deserts to be part of this the suffering that car-focused economies have created. Like perhaps if we weren't so car dominated, the store wouldn't have to be so far from people's homes. And I don't think this is something you did write about in the book, but it's, this is certainly something we have in Massachusetts, where grocery stores, supermarkets are usually quite far away and require, in some cases, multiple bus rides. And then once you get there, you have to cross a huge parking lot for the car owners. What do you think of the sort of the food desert situation?
Well, I do think there's like overt discrimination happening. Like, I've heard the term retail redlining used.
Yeah.
It's a big problem where I live in Cleveland. We really don't have very much retail throughout the whole city. A lot of
Mhm.
Rust Belt cities are like that, and I think it would be very bizarre to someone coming from Boston. But like we really have like only a handful of clothing stores in Cleveland. If you want to buy clothing, you sort of like you could get it at a dollar store, and there are a couple big box stores at a couple locations, but those might be difficult to access on foot.
Yeah.
Um, and then you sort of have to go out to the suburbs.
Right.
So, I mean, I think it plays a role, but I don't think there's a lot there's a lot going on. One
Yeah.
thing that's sort of a problem is that and I, like I mentioned, I thought about expanding on this a little bit in the book, and I just didn't, looking at sort of what's happening in retail, and the trend in retail for a long time has been bigger and bigger sort of footprints, and that includes grocery stores. Like, I used to be a reporter before I worked at newspapers in Ohio, before I worked at StreetsblogMASS. And I remember being in like a rural community, and they were so desperate for a grocery store because they had to drive, I forget, 20-25 minutes to the grocery store.
Yeah.
And Kroger was, at the time, which is a local or a regional grocery chain, was not building any stores smaller than like 25,000 square feet. So, I mean, I do think that's definitely people's willingness to travel sort of far, and the competition is a factor
Yeah.
also. But I don't think we should discount like the amount of discrimination, like overt racial discrimination,
Right.
that happens like in the corporate sector, from grocery stores to banks.
Yeah. Oh, we have another question here about speed limits and how speed limits are set. What, I don't think you did get into this too much in the book, but you talked about the manual of uniform traffic control devices and sort of like that culture and how that makes things difficult. Is speed limit policy similar to that, or is that part of the manual?
No, I think that's a good question.
Yeah.
That might be a better question for an engineer. But so it is a regulatory problem. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll say that. And I think the MUCT the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, does talk about the 85th percentile rule,
Mhm.
and that kind of thing. So in Ohio, we were just talking about this. I was talking with a couple Vision Zero people from around the state, and they're saying it's a huge problem. We don't have control over our speed limits in the city. It's governed by state statute.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I mentioned in the book. The World Health Organization says that's not a good practice. You're not in compliance with World Health Organization traffic safety best practices if localities don't have control over the speed limit. And that's the case in the United States. And a lot of almost all the other wealthy nations and even some middle income nations and lower income nations are in compliance with many of these World Health Organization best practices that we are not, and that's one of them. So like it goes back to it's like this in almost every state. I think you've made some progress on it. I wrote about that in Massachusetts and in the Boston area.
Mhm.
But it goes back to like this highway era mindset, the same problem in the MUTCD, where I think the state law was designed to protect drivers from speed traps, not to protect pedestrians from being hit by cars. That
Right.
wasn't really a factor at all. It just hasn't been a consideration. And there, we do have examples of that in Ohio where certain municipalities do abuse sort of speed limit rules to make money. But we're a red state, and it's really challenging
Yeah.
to to look at that kind of stuff again.
Yeah. Um, just for people in the audience, just wanted to note that speed limit policies are generally governed by the 85th percentile rule, which basically lets drivers crowdsource, whatever speed drivers are going, that's going to be the speed limit. And it tends to escalate over time because everybody breaks the speed limit. So it keeps on going higher and higher. But Massachusetts, as Angie mentioned, Massachusetts is in the process of re-examining its speed limit policies. And actually, I did write a story about it in StreetsblogMASS a few months ago. And I should probably do a follow-up because now I'm curious about where that's at. But something to keep an eye on.
One other thing, this is like very nerdy, but this seems like this is
Yeah,
probably the right
that's the
crowd.
right crowd here. Yeah.
So they just announced that they've been working on updating the MUTCD, which is something we've been waiting on for 10 years.
Mhm.
Like we've been waiting on the engineering profession to give the green light to like protected bike lanes and that kind of thing for a really long time, for like a little over a decade. And now they have released like their first draft of the new MUTCD. And I
Mhm.
think that they did de-emphasize this 85th percentile rule. So, and that's sort of happening across the board now.
Yeah.
So they're going to have less of an excuse to sort of fall back on that. But um, people who are like traffic engineers might be able to say better than me whether it goes far enough.
Yeah. That's good. That's some good news. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was this issue of increasing pickup truck size and higher hoods. As an advocate, I feel like we have some control over things like infrastructure and like decriminalizing jaywalking and things like that. But I feel a lot less clear about what advocates can do about this trend of consumers buying bigger and bigger, more massive, deadly pickup trucks. And electric cars are even heavier and more deadly if we're going to start shifting to that. So, do you get a sense whether the Biden administration is going to be able to do anything about this to regulate truck sizes? Is there anything states can do? Like, what would you be your recommended course of action for an advocate who cared about this particular issue?
Yeah, I would love to see like local advocates get more engaged in
Mhm.
those kind of issues. And I actually have I'm working on some things
Okay.
that may sort of help facilitate that a little bit that aren't sort of ready for prime time or to be announced yet.
Okay. Cool.
Um, but there absolutely could be some good opportunities in the Biden administration. For example, I mentioned this in the book, so I keep saying that. I don't want to be repeating stuff people already know, but um, Obama had proposed overhauling the five-star vehicle safety rating system in the United States. It's called NCAP. He had proposed overhauling that and adding a rating for pedestrian impacts. And then the Trump administration just didn't do it. They just sat on the rule for 4 years. So that's something, this is sort of some low hanging fruit. We could at least be rating cars based on, right now we don't even know very well which cars are safer and which are more dangerous, like model by model, because nobody is running tests. Nobody's running cars into dummy pedestrians in the United States at all. They do it in Europe though. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of low hanging fruit. There's a little bit of momentum behind that. I think that's something that would be, hopefully we'll see that accomplished. And there's other things too, like some of this stuff I'm not even sure about. One thing I wonder is like, could a municipality like a Boston or could MassDOT get into, actually I know at the state level, they can regulate aftermarket modifications. So some states limit how high you can lift a truck. I think it would be interesting to see someone try to regulate bull bars, which are those metal bars that are affixed to the front of cars. Yeah. And like, even there's so much low hanging fruit with this. People are like, we need to ban SUVs, and can we do that? And I'm just like, there's so many steps, and one of them is like, a lot of police departments now are putting these bull bars. They're all buying SUVs now, and they're all putting these bull bars on them, and no one even complains. Like nobody goes to when they're making the purchasing decision, nobody goes to City Hall and says, hey, this is A, more dangerous, and B, more expensive for taxpayers, just to make you look like scarier and more macho, which is not what we want, right now from our police departments. So even like something like that, there usually isn't any pushback. And when I was in Portland last fall, I did my presentation in Portland before all this happened, and TriMet's police force has SUVs with bull bars. The city, Portland PD, same thing. And this is a Vision Zero city that's supposed to be this big leader, and so there's a lot. And that sometimes these regulatory fights they could have a big impact nationally, just nobody's paying attention to them. Right. So there are opportunities also, like I mentioned in the book, with some of these new vehicle safety technologies like automatic emergency braking or pedestrian detection. There's not even really any active campaign that, at least it has people at the grassroots level involved, about requiring that kind of thing, at least on some of these more dangerous vehicles. We have the speed limiters. So we're not gonna, in Europe, they're making them standard in every vehicle. By 2021, you're not gonna be able to speed in Europe, or 2022. But we haven't even done that for commercial vehicles, for these heavy trucks on the highway. Or we haven't required speed limiters for convicted drunk drivers, or people who have multiple infractions. There's just a lot of ways that could be incorporated to make people safer that we just haven't even tried. Those fights haven't even begun.
Yeah.
Sorry, I get a little
all right. Yeah. So defund police bull bars seems like a winnable action.
Yeah, you can at least complain.
And another thing you recommend in your conclusion, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, is like just trying to change the narrative framing of how we talk about pedestrian deaths, and like stop victim blaming people, and stop treating these deaths as an inevitability, and then start, like the Families for Safe Streets groups are like saying like we actually like holding elected leaders accountable for these deaths, and this is something that elected officials are responsible for, by putting in things like crosswalks. So actually, speaking of that, there's a question in our Q&A about, you know, someone who's had a lot of trouble getting the city to install just a simple crosswalk in their neighborhood. They had to do a direct message exchange on Twitter with their state rep and senator to get it done. Cars immediately started respecting the crosswalk a lot more. Why is getting a crosswalk so difficult in so many places?
I have like a whole chapter about this in the book. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like such a dumb thing. Yeah, it's like all comes back to this. They don't want to delay drivers. I think
Yeah,
that's
right.
like they invented all these rationalizations and put them in this book and made them sound scientific, but they just don't. There's a hierarchy, and safety is, you know, subordinated to speed.
Yeah. Yeah.
For journeys and I think it goes back to, I think in Boston things are a little different, but in a lot of the United States, everyone who has money is driving. The people who are walking are low income. So I think that contributes.
Yeah, for sure. Our board member Matt says things are not different in Boston.
Well, at least you have, I mean, like, I think like you do have
some things are the same
like,
everywhere. You know, we're still America. Yeah, we're still part of the United States of America. There's, you know, we get a lot of drivers who aren't from Boston, who are from, you know, all over, you know, pretty rural areas. So, yeah. Another question in here is about, you know, you mentioned in the book, there's obviously equity issues with police-based enforcement and how police enforce traffic laws, and it's pretty arbitrary and not very helpful. But this person's curious about what you think of automated enforcement and things like red light cameras.
So yeah, I think like I'm generally, I'm supportive, but I think you have to be really careful. Just because it's very sensitive politically, and B, also the fines really can be really difficult for some people, and the placement of them, and there's a lot of issues that can arise. Like, I think it's hard for cities to get it right. It's hard for cities to get it right. They're outlawed where I live in Cleveland. We were using them, and there was like overwhelming support for outlawing them.
Yeah.
And I don't think the city of Cleveland did a very good job of, they just sort of put them up, and I don't think they really did. There really wasn't any evidence that they cared very much. It wasn't tied to a wider safety effort.
Yeah.
So I think like the cities that, like in New York, where they are using them in school zones, I think there's sort of a good approach. I've written at StreetsBlog in more detail, like some of the best practices.
Do you get a sense, like, because I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like speed cameras and red light cameras are used pretty extensively in the Sun Belt. Like, I know there are a lot of them in Florida, and I don't know about other states. We just had a Boston area senator in the state legislature try to introduce a speed camera bill with automated enforcement for, I think it would have allowed 1 or 2 cameras per municipality, plus every school bus in the state. So it was like very tied to like safety around school buses. And that got shot down. So yeah, I mean, like, curious about, you know, obviously like the New York City example is very vivid, but you know, I'm curious what other jurisdictions that have had some success with automated enforcement, like what else has been key to those successes.
So I don't know if I have a very good answer for that. But
yeah.
one thing that comes to mind, there was a woman in Florida whose husband that I wrote about, she was 9 months pregnant.
Mhm.
and her husband went to the store and got hit by a red light runner and killed, T-boned.
Mhm.
And she's been on this like crusade in Florida for the use of red light cameras. It's a very difficult fight for her, but they have such terrible outcomes there. I think,
Yeah.
I mean, to me, and I want to tread lightly because I'm not part of one of the groups that's really been victimized by police violence, and I sort of will defer
Yeah.
to folks who do have that, who have more knowledge about that. But the way we're doing it with police is really bad.
Yeah.
Is
Right.
really bad. I don't. It would be much better to just use speed limiters. But
Yeah.
again, no one's even trying. No one's even really pushing for that.
Mhm.
I think
Um,
it's a difficult fight. It's not though. Also,
yeah. So, but they're being used. I think you mentioned in the book they're going to be pretty widespread in the European Union pretty soon, right?
speed cameras.
Or speed limiters, like
Yes,
in
they're
cars.
going to
Yeah.
be standard.
Yeah.
Although someone told me that there's some kind of loophole
Huh.
that people can exploit.
Sure.
I should look into it more. But yeah, they have made it mandatory.
Yeah. Um, see if there are any questions. Are there any questions I've missed in the Q&A here? I guess if there's no more questions from the audience, I do have, yeah, Matt Lawler asked, and this is one I was going to ask too. What are you working on next?
Yeah, so one thing I've been doing is taking care of my kids because schools
Yeah.
are closed.
Yeah, right.
And recovering from Corona. But I did launch this. I launched a consultancy space out of Cleveland where I live, and I wanna work on projects that I think are gonna help make a difference. And I'm gonna be sort of trying to um, ferret those out and get involved with that and trying to promote. I have actually spent a lot of time promoting this book and doing talks like this.
Mhm.
So I think I've reached like several thousand people for sure with this message. Yeah, and I'm hoping I do have a couple things like that are sort of in the works that I again um are not ready for prime time to be announced. But yeah, I'm just looking for ways to sort of advance good outcomes, better outcomes like on the ground with my work right now.
Yeah.
I am actually hosting this conference tomorrow for Ohio sustainable transportation people, just like a Zoom conference. We're trying to get better organized at the state level in Ohio, some folks, and get people like more energized. And I'm involved with the state budget fight
Mhm.
here, which is sort of a volunteer thing, but
Yeah.
trying to get more money for transit walking and biking in the state of Ohio.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for writing this book for all of us to read. I enjoyed it a lot, and I really enjoyed your work for StreetsblogUSA. I was a longtime reader before I joined StreetsblogMASS, so it's really nice to finally meet you kind of in person.
Yeah. Thanks for reading the book and promoting it, and to everyone who came and for your work in Boston. I wish I could have been there in person, but
Yeah, hopefully, look us up someday after this pandemic is over.
I do. I have a ladies' weekend planned in Boston that was postponed by all this, so it may
bummer.
happen.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Angie, for speaking. Thank you, Christian. Once again, this is, we're trying to do these more often. So if you like these events and you like StreetsBlog, we would love you to support our work. I dropped a link in the chat where you can do that. I also put a link in there so you can buy Angie's book in case you haven't yet purchased it or haven't yet purchased it for any of your family and friends who should also know more about this work. There's also a link in the chat there for a reader survey. We would love you to take that. You can win a rain cape from Cleverhood. The drawing is going to be at the end of the week. So once again, thanks everyone for participating. Oh, one last thing. If you have the idea for a book that we should read next, please let us know. This event was co-hosted by Walk Boston. Disclosure, I am the deputy director at Walk Boston. Walk Boston is a statewide pedestrian advocacy organization. We were a co-host for this, so if you also know of an organization that should be a co-host for a future event, please let us know. So thank you everyone for being here tonight. Have a good one.
Thanks everyone.